Hello everyone. Once again, I would like to continue discussing concepts of morality, but this time I'm not going to be limiting myself to a simulated universe. Instead, in this instance I want to give a response to a recent tweet I read. Oh yes, that reminds me, I am back on Twitter now, but just in case Twitter bots decide to try to silence me once more before Mr. Musk can correct the problem, I've also decided to get a Telegram channel. This is because the most important reasons for why I use Twitter depend largely on gathering as much data from both Russian and Ukrainian sources as I can, and both Russians and Ukrainians use Telegram far more than Twitter. The only problem is that they tend not to translate as much on Telegram as they do on Twitter, since they know Twitter is more for English speakers. But I have ways of getting data translated. Google Translate will give me a basically accurate interpretation, and I am in regular contact with both Ukrainians and Russians who can assist with anything that's untranslatable. But on to my point for this video. Back on Twitter, I follow a particular person. I'm not going to be dropping his name here since it's not relevant, and I also don't want anyone to spam this individual. I mean, no one should feel the desire to do so based on what I'm going to talk about, but logic doesn't follow very frequently on social media. That's why I say it's better to call it, not social media, but anti-social media. This particular individual is an amateur philosopher. I don't mean to disparage him by saying that. It is, in fact, the label he gives himself. In my opinion, he's better than most professional philosophers. While he is an atheist and I am not, I still respect his views because he's much more capable of discussion than the typical Reddit atheist is. In other words, he asks probing questions, and he responds to well-thought-out critiques. Anyway, this individual asked a question the other day in a tweet, and I want to address it here in more detail than I could on Twitter. The tweet in reference gave a poll and asked the question, if God did not exist, would people still have a moral duty not to? And then he used a word which YouTube is often picky about, so I will just say it rhymes with great. In response to this, because I know Twitter limitations, I said a simple, nature is red in tooth and claw. If you're unfamiliar with that sentence, you may think it a bit odd to quote. However, I did so because I assumed that this gentleman would understand the context, and given that context there would be an implicit argument provided which was more than I could fit into a single tweet. But to explain it here, the statement nature is red in tooth and claw is derived from Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, In Memoriam, A.H.H. and comes from Canto 56. Specifically, it refers to mankind and says, and trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravine, shrieked against his creed. More than just that specific usage of the term is the fact that the phrase has been used repeatedly to describe the actions of predatory animals in nature. Predators cover their teeth and claws in the blood of the prey they devour. This is the default mode of nature, and because that really is the default mode of nature, it has often been used in philosophy, particularly when it comes to advocating the problem of evil as a genuine problem against theism. In short, when I responded to the philosopher by pointing out that nature was red in tooth and claw, my point was to use the illustration provided by atheists against Christianity, against atheism itself. Thus, by implication, if the natural state of being is one where predators cover their teeth and claws in the blood of the prey, why would you expect there to be any moral standards of behavior anyone has a duty to observe? Nature doesn't push forth any sense of duty whatsoever. Think of it this way. A male lion will often go and kill the offspring of rival lions. He will then mate with the lioness to replace the offspring with his own lineage. The lion doesn't care about what the original lion, the lion cubs, or the lionesses want in this scenario. He just does what he wants to, because he has power to do so. That is nature. Because that is how nature operates, I do not expect a sense of duty to arise from nature itself. Now this alone is not the reason I want to bring this topic up in this video. The philosopher I was talking with responded and asked, how do you go from that to a world just like ours, minus God, lacks a moral duty to, for you to begin? Great. And I responded beginning with, a world just like ours, minus God isn't able to exist. But pretending it could, there is no duty in such a universe. Your feeling of duty just happens to be what a certain pattern of neurons generates, and it certainly isn't intrinsic to all minds. Animals don't care about it. Truncating a little bit, my basic point was this. How do you generate any sense of ought beginning from the inanimate? If it's all physics and chemistry, you have to connect the dots to show it coming from those processes, and you have to show they are obligatory that way. The point being, an atheist has the burden of proof to demonstrate why there is a moral duty if there is no God. See, if God exists, then it makes sense that there would be a moral duty to obey the commands of such a God, because he is able to establish that sense of duty. But if there is no God, then what reason is there to assert moral duty at all? Now that was where I was going with the conversation, but the philosopher actually responded back to the first bit, where I said a world just like ours minus God isn't able to exist. His response wasn't to refute that claim, but instead to point out that he had thought he had sufficiently set up the question such that the objection I stated wouldn't have applied, but perhaps he was mistaken in thinking he had accomplished this task. And I want to be clear, this guy is not a Reddit atheist seeking a flame war, so I believe him when he says that's what he tried to do, and I don't view him not responding to anything else as having a negative impact on him. The conversation clearly went in a direction he thought he had avoided, but because that's where my response went, he acknowledged that he had perhaps not sufficiently set up the boundary to get the response in the channel he intended. In any case, he was under no obligation to actually do a dialogue with me on any part of this, let alone down that specific pathway when it wasn't ever his intention in the first place. So, I'm fine with him giving his stated intention. How the direction the response went showed his initial point may not have been sufficiently structured, and therefore he has no need to respond further at all. But I did want to probe the thought a bit further here, on my channel where I have the ability to write more than 280 characters at a time, and where I can flesh out the reasons why I responded the way I did. See, it's quite easy for someone to ask another person to assume you are wrong about this topic and ask them what they would conclude given that. In fact, that is a technique I often employ for myself. I went through my Descartes phase. Doubt everything and see what you can still prove. The Cartesian demon analogy is a very effective way to get to presuppositional groundings. That's when you not only doubt the truth of everything you hold, but you literally assume that a demon exists and is intentionally lying to you to try to trick you. If everything you think is true is really a trick of the devil, what do you actually know? Descartes concluded, I think, therefore I am. In a similar vein, I concluded my own examination with, I perceive, therefore I am. The problem is, having established that fact, that is, if everything I believe is a lie, then I still must exist in order to perceive the lie, then that is not the end of the discussion. At this point, I can begin to ask questions like, if I must exist, because clearly something is having these perceptions such that even if the perceptions are false, the perception is perceived and the being that does the perceiving is what I'm identifying with the word I. If I therefore have direct access to the knowledge that I exist, then what does that logically imply? And at that point, I shaped the argument that I've made before on this channel, that if you accept the validity of logic, then necessarily you accept the existence of something which has the basic attributes that are traditionally those ascribed to God in theism. That is, we have established that something must be self-existent, eternal, meaning outside the realm of space and time, omnipresent to ensure the validity of logic is also everywhere. Something must be universal. It must have an unchangeable attribute, identified as immutability, at least in reference to whatever it is that makes logic immutably valid. And therein lies the problem. If you ask me to imagine a world in which there is no God, but the very fact that logic presupposes the existence of such an entity, then what you are literally asking me to imagine is to imagine myself being completely irrational, completely illogical, completely unreasonable. You cannot ask me to be irrational, and then demand that I am able to come up with a rational morality from that platform. Instead, if you want for me to imagine a universe without God, you have to be able to supply a counter foundation that would supply rationality. You see, I am quite sure that this atheist I'm dialoguing with, as well as any other atheists or agnostics who watch this video, I'm sure you do not struggle with grounding logic or reason apart from the existence of God. But I have examined the issue myself and have been unable to find a way to actually ground logic apart from stipulating the existence of some form of deity. So, if you want me to abandon theism, you have to be able to replace the functionality that theism provides to me with an alternative that actually functions for me. If you can show me how logic can be valid even if there is no self-existent, transcendent, universal, immutable being, whatever you decide to name that being, then, and only then, do I have the ability to imagine such a world and not be confined to an irrational universe where nothing matters anyway, since logic doesn't reach there. In short, if you want me to accept that there are moral duties, you have to prove that such a concept can arise, and to prove it can arise, it needs to be grounded in an objective form of logic and reasoning that has the ability to actually establish its objectivity. Otherwise, moral duty is just an internal delusion that some people hold, and others don't. And if morality is simply the particular habits that certain individuals prefer, then your particular habits are yours. I have no reason to follow those mandates, especially if doing so will cost me. Indeed, why should I have to follow your habits and desires instead of you having to follow mine? Of course, you might be able to gather more people who agree with you than I have who agree with me on an issue. You might then declare, we have a police force to keep those who do not fit in with the rest of our values in check. You could literally become the Twitter Truth and Safety Commission deciding that certain people just aren't allowed to express certain ideas because you have the power to censor them and you will use that power. Who is there to stop you? Yes, you could definitely just say that you will use violence against me if I don't accept your view of morality. But then, isn't that what the person committing that isn't that what he is doing to the one he overwhelms with force? If might makes right when it comes to the police force requiring you to behave in a certain manner, why doesn't might make right when a man wants a specific thing from a woman that he cannot obtain freely? What is the logical argument showing why the use of force is morally fine in the first scenario but is not allowable in the second? This isn't a trivial point. It's sort of essential to the whole concept of morality. Either way, I hope it is something worthwhile to think about. And with that, I hope you all have a thoughtful and productive day, learning about why you believe what you do, and understanding why exactly there is a moral duty to do what is right. That duty doesn't appear to come from nature itself, so what must be true in order for that duty to actually be enforceable? Again, I don't care if you agree or disagree with my conclusions, as long as you can provide an alternate path that can still provide an actual sense of duty being more than just a subjective feeling. So, have at it and let me know what it is.